everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Taylor Porter. I'm the Medical Device Security Analyst with Health ISAC, and I will be introducing today's speakers from Medcrypt. Our presenters for our events today are Alex Wirth, the Chief Security Strategist. Alex Wirth provides strategic vision and industry leadership to Medcrypt and its customers. In his role, he helps guide the company in critical security strategy decisions and supports the adoption of leading security technologies by the healthcare industry. He's an advocate for compliance, privacy, and security, and ultimately patient safety in healthcare. Wirth draws from over 30 years of international experience in the industry. And our second speaker for today is Christian Rosenzweig. Christian worked for more than 10 years in software development for medical devices. There, as a project manager and software developer, he was responsible for the support and operational implementation of tasks in the product lifecycle for the creation of documentation and training materials for the end users, and for implementation and support of conformity assessment procedures in the EU. Dealing with regulatory requirements on a daily basis ultimately led him to quality management at a large corporation where he was able to gain international experience as a quality management officer under ISO 13485. He has been supporting the consulting team at the Honor Institute since 2019. And then before we begin today, I'll be going over some housekeeping notes. I'd like to inform everyone today that the webinar will be recorded and made available should you wish to revisit today's contents. And then feel free to post any questions to the available Q&A section so that we may address them at today's end of today's presentation. We should have about 10 or 15 minutes to do so. So with that, I'll pass it to our speakers from Medcrypt.
Yes, welcome everybody, and thanks for having us. So today's discussion will be a back and forth between Christian and myself on various topics pertaining to cybersecurity and medical device regulations, and especially the contrast between the FDA, the US environment, and the European environment. So we don't have a formal presentation. We have a couple of slides to guide us through the presentation, and the recording will become available afterwards. So will the slides, including additional resources. So appreciate you joining, and Christian, if you want to kick off the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. So we will start today with a kind of case study, just as a very simple and easy example for demonstration. So we talk about a ventilator machine that is used in a hospital, and this ventilator machine is connected to the hospital network. It gets infected by malware while ventilating, and as such, it becomes part of a spam botnet and starts to send out spam emails at high volumes. Luckily, there's no impact to the connected patient, but the network is overloaded by spam emails, so the performance of the network goes down. And the possible impact on other patients would be that, for example, or other information network provide time, X-ray images cannot be read and stored, etc. So there's impact network by that on other medical devices. And this is a typical scenario that FDA will a multi-patient harm scenario. So even if the own medical devices, the safety and performance, it's an impact medical devices. This is something that's required FDA in their latest pre-market guidance document. They specifically ask for the so-called architectural view. This includes a closed view and a multi-patient harm, both of which could identify these types of scenarios and the manufacturer to explain how to mitigate it. And our today is, with that case study of that ventilator machine, what would have prevented scenario? What can be done up from a preventive way to achieve security by design?
Yeah, so Christian, good example, the ventilator that became part of a spam distributing botnet. And as you mentioned, I remembered several other examples from my cybersecurity days, going now 15 years back, for example, an ultrasound imaging system that became also part of a botnet and also was busy sending out spam emails across the hospital and outside of the hospital network, rather than distributing ultrasound images to the PACS. So really not an unusual scenario, unfortunately. And the question is, what is the underlying root cause? In this example, okay, it's fairly simple and straightforward. It is an outdated Windows 3.11 operating system. And certainly there are some underlying contributing factors, including the hospital's awareness of these type of legacy devices being on its network, lack of end-of-life communication by the manufacturer potentially, lack of replacement planning by the hospital. Did they actually understand the risk and were they ready to replace critical devices like a ventilator? And then also, obviously, a lack of external security controls external to the actual device that maybe not would have totally prevented the situation, but certainly could have reduced the risk. So, what is required in order to address situations like these? It's full transparency of all inventory. And that has a slightly different meaning for the hospital, right? For the hospital, it means visibility of all devices on their network and knowledge about their software status, their software composition. For the manufacturer, it is more along the lines of the individual device and understanding all the software components that are in the device and what their respective end-of-life status is. And obviously, software bill of materials and SBOM becomes a critical component here that provides the core information about the overall software composition, but also should provide supplementary information that is not typically part of the technical definition of an SBOM, and that would be, for example, end-of-life information and support status. And this type of information can then be used by the manufacturer as well as by the operator of the device to address problems like these. And again, back to my point, the Windows 3.11 example is very basic, but it does highlight that SBOM and why SBOM is on everybody's mind today. And this also highlights why regulators like the FDA here in the US, for example, are asking for additional information that is typically not found in a more technical SBOM. Specifically, the FDA is spelling out in their pre-market guidance from September 2023 that additional data fields are required, such as software level of support, as well as component end of support dates. So therefore, having an SBOM enables the manufacturer to understand their component life cycle, early and proactively identify end-of-life, end-of-support components from the highest level, like Windows 3.11 in this example, but also down to lower and deeper levels of the software. For example, an unsupported TLS library, unsupported Bluetooth radio, similar components. Obviously, the manufacturer is also able to use an SBOM to identify and respond to newly found vulnerabilities. But ideally, the manufacturer should use the SBOM to consult regularly vulnerability databases and conclude and assess the risk of newly found vulnerabilities that surface through those databases. Similar for the hospital as the device operator and maintainer, the SBOM also helps with their replacement planning, as well as also proactively to identify vulnerabilities. But in order for this to work, obviously, the manufacturer and the hospital need to share SBOMs. And it also requires that the hospital can make meaningful use of the SBOM information, which is an area, frankly, which I believe we as an industry are still challenged. I think we still need to work through best practices and develop the right processes that the SBOM on the receiving end, on the hospitals end can actually be used in a constructive and meaningful way. And then the SBOM obviously can link to supplemental information such as vulnerabilities, such as end of life and support status. Reason I'm calling that linking to supplemental information is that the SBOM itself, the composition of a device, is typically very static, right? That is a given for a given device and a given version. But over time, new vulnerabilities come out, end of life dates may change, may shift, support status may change, and therefore that information is typically not directly provided in the SBOM, but is provided as an adjunct to the SBOM and is then used through public and private databases, for example, that provide vulnerabilities and vulnerability information. And even though that approach is not perfect, it does, again, allow us to become proactive. End of life identification is more tricky. That is not as readily provided. There are a few solutions out there that provide end of life dates for components, but typically they have a specific software platform, for example, as a target, or a specific manufacturer as a target. And sometimes you even have to collect information from multiple sources in order to get correct end-of-life information. Or frankly, in some cases, may not even be available if you're dealing with open source, for example, software components. So vulnerabilities, yes, we have databases we can query. There are some challenges, but they can be overcome with the right tools and the right approach. End of life is a little more tricky, but again, we're also, as an industry, working on solutions there and have implemented, initial solutions to start to address it. So to circle back, obviously, an SBOM would allow us to detect outdated components like the Windows operating system, but also components that are embedded much deeper. Think back to 2021, the Log4Shell vulnerability that was a vulnerability in the Log4j utility, which in many systems was deeply embedded, and it is estimated that it affected more than 100 million systems worldwide because it was so widely used in the Java environment. And it is also estimated that it will take until the end of the decade that all systems are properly upgraded. So again, that whole vulnerability management topic has varying degrees of complexity, depending on, again, what component you're looking at. So to wrap up my discussion, my point here, clearly manufacturers need to communicate end of support dates. Hospitals need to have better visibility of their components to identify legacy devices, to do proper replacement planning for new devices. But also that requires that the hospital recognizes that there is a risk, right? In this particular case, the hospital may have very well been aware of the outdated operating system, but may not have felt, and I'm just speculating here, that the risk was high enough to justify investing in a replacement device. Nevertheless, SBOM is a good tool here. It helps us in the pre-market to identify vulnerabilities and potential risks as we design new devices. It helps in the market approval process because we can demonstrate to regulators and notified bodies that approving authorities understand that the manufacturer has control over their vulnerability management processes via an SBOM. SBOM can also be used in the post-market so that both manufacturers and operators can continuously monitor for new vulnerabilities that come up over the life of the device. And then also, obviously, should a software component reach the end of support, the operator can assess the risk and can take action either again external security controls like network segregation, firewalls, or device replacement. Christian, back to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Axel. So you mentioned a lot of topics around the SBOM, and from my customers, I know that it is very difficult for them to create and maintain SBOMs. For that, from my discussion with you, I know that Medcrypt provides a software solution for SBOM management. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, especially on what are your experiences with or without such a software solution?
Yes, sure. So clearly, and I already hinted on that earlier, there are a couple of challenges with SBOM. Right? SBOM is oftentimes compared to the food ingredients list of foods you buy at the supermarket. It is not quite as simple, right? The SBOM is much more complex. The length of the SBOM itself is already a problem by itself, right? If you go in depth across multiple layers of your software, you may end up with hundreds or thousands of individual entries that need to be correctly identified. You need to make sure that you have all supply chain components covered, but you may, for example, buy a software component, but the supplier may not disclose to you what's underneath it. There are various challenges that can come with that. Your SBOM, you may have challenges to access, for example, end-of-life dates for open source software that may or may not be known, or there may not be a defined roadmap for that open source software when, for example, new features, versions, or vulnerability fixes will be available. So the complexity of the SBOM itself and the completeness of the information are certainly challenges where we need good tools, solid tools to help us solve those. Obviously, I need to maintain my SBOM over time, and I need to do that for every new configuration I'm creating, as well as support it also for old configurations that are still in use and out in the field. So clearly, it is not just for the most recent device, but it should span the entire portfolio and all versions of my portfolio. And depending on the size of a medical device manufacturer, that can be several hundreds of devices, and if you include versions, probably thousands of different versions. From the hospital side, obviously, first of all, the operator needs to have access to the respective SBOM, and that is both a technical, a sharing, but also a legal and access right kind of challenges. Hospitals have hundreds, if not thousands, of devices on their networks. They come from dozens, if not hundreds, or more of different manufacturers. So their library of SBOM over time will become very large, and then they need to be able to correctly match the SBOM version to the correct device, which again, because of complexity, can be quite challenging. Once you're past that, you then need to use the SBOM to identify the vulnerabilities via public vulnerability databases. And unfortunately, depending on the vulnerability database you use and depending on the matching algorithm to match a software component name in your SBOM to the component name in the vulnerability database, you actually may end up with a different list of vulnerabilities than the manufacturer does. So there is some need for reconciliation. And then lastly, on the hospital side, you do not have insight into the design details and the configuration details of the device. So you may know if a certain vulnerability exists in your device, but you may not know whether it is actually exploitable. The simple example I always use is you pick a Windows port vulnerability, and that particular port is actually closed as part of the configuration process by the manufacturer, so that that particular vulnerability is not exploitable, but that may not be obvious and visible to you as the as the operator of the device. So clearly, because of all these challenges, a robust software solution for SBOM management is required. And many SBOM tools that are out there today were designed for a different purpose, right? They're more designed as software development tools rather than vulnerability management tools or even vulnerability sharing tools. And clearly, we need to make sure that we use the right tool for the purpose. And then lastly, getting back to my previous comment about, okay, granted, Windows 3.11 is a very simple example here. It probably wouldn't need an SBOM to identify that particular problem. There should be other more basic vulnerability, software documentation that the manufacturer should provide that gives you the insight on the level of the operating system. For example, the manufacturer disclosure statement for medical device security, short MDS2, that NEMA provides as a template, and that manufacturers can provide together with other security documentation. But again, that is only a solution, I think, for this very simple example. If you go deeper, log4shell, for example, you do need an SBOM. You do need the deeper analysis.
Yeah. Okay, so we saw that the SBOM would have helped in transparency about the contained old, outdated operating system in that case study here. Transparency for the manufacturer and the operator as they receive the SBOM. So knowing the outdated component of the operating system would have caused the replacement of the operating system in the ventilator, and that would be a security measure that would have been done afterwards. It is very important to know that a good SBOM would provide in-depth visibility of all components, their end-of-life status, and known vulnerabilities. That is what Axel already said. So I absolutely confirm the importance of SBOM and also confirm the challenges of manufacturers in managing the SBOM. It is also important to emphasize that the strong requirement for SBOM in the United States and Europe and many other markets is given. So SBOM is a very crucial requirement in cybersecurity. And if we compare the SBOM specific requirements between Europe and US, we will see that both markets require SBOM. FDA is very precise, has a very specific requirement in the FDA pre-market guidance document. In Europe, there's no very specific requirement in the regulatory documents. We know that the IEC 81001-5-1, which is a lifecycle standard for cybersecurity, which is on the harmonization list in Europe, requires an SBOM in the context of configuration management. So saying this, both markets require SBOM, but FDA on top of that is very specific on the format of the SBOM. So it refers to the NTIA framing document and requires to establish at least the baseline attributes like the component name, the component version, a hash value, the vendor of the component, and so on. So they are very clear with the requirement. And FDA also requires additionally some information like the software level of support provided from the software component manufacturer, whether the software is actively maintained, no longer maintained, or abandoned. And it requires to also show the software component's end of support date, at least if it is predictable. The European Union requires an additional attribute for the so-called risk transfer. So it's a very specific, I would say, concept by the 81001-5-1. It has an attribute within the SBOM that says which of the software items are maintained, supported, or required. Maintained means that the full responsibility for that component is at the manufacturer of the device. So he takes care for vulnerability monitoring and the corresponding update and patching process. Required means the manufacturer is completely out of responsibility. The responsibility lays completely on the operator. So for example, with the case study here with the ventilator machine, as long as the Windows 3.11 system, operating system, is managed by Microsoft, the manufacturer would take over the full responsibility for that component. So it's a maintained software item, and wherever an update is needed, the manufacturer takes care for that. And as soon as the operating system is not patched anymore by Microsoft, the manufacturer would shift within the SBOM the attribute from maintained to required. So it's a required component then, and that means as a signal to the operator that he is now, from now on, responsible for that component. So one activity of the operator would be to disconnect the machine from the network, for example, because the operating system is not patched anymore. So you see there is challenge for both markets in creating and maintaining an SBOM, especially if you want to integrate additional information like this attribute of maintained, supported, and required, or the end of support date that's required by the FDA. And as Axel said, you should have a software solution that supports you in providing this additional information. So let's finish the topic of SBOM here. We said it would have helped significantly in transparency of vulnerabilities within the software for the manufacturer and the operator of the device. And let's switch to the next big block of requirements, and this is the threat modeling. Threat modeling is a method that is required also in the context of cybersecurity, and that's a method that somehow belongs to architectural design and at the same time to the security risk management. What does threat modeling mean? How is it done? So the first step is to draw a system in a way that you use a data flow diagram with 5 typical entities. And those entities are data flow, data store, process, external entities, and trust boundaries. And if you model your device or your device system out of those components or entities, then you can do risk analysis based on that diagram. So that means that you search for threats, vulnerabilities, and corresponding assets, and the combination of threat, vulnerability, and the corresponding asset is considered as risk. The risk must be estimated by the severity of impact and the exploitability, and you have to identify countermeasures. And countermeasures can also be in a change of the architectural design to make the architectural design more robust in the context of cybersecurity. So for the ventilator machine, it would have been identified that the operating system is accessible by malware, and different measures would have been implemented, like, for example, a carefully segregating data processing part and functional part, so that there's no impact by the data processing part towards the essential performance of the device. A decision and justification for using a standard operating system would have been done or challenged. Closing unnecessary open ports would have been an activity. Terminating unnecessary running services of the operating system would be an activity, or mitigating all known vulnerability at the development time for the operating system, which is again based on the SBOM, that you search for known vulnerability of that operating system and you apply all patches or deal somehow with the known vulnerabilities. So the result of this security risk analysis must be consolidated with the safety risk analysis in order to find impacts of security issues on the health of humans. So there's a link between the security risk analysis based on threat modeling and the corresponding ISO 14971 risk management process. And for third-party components, we cannot do a proper threat modeling, as third-party components are black boxes for us. So we need another risk analysis method, and this is exactly what we said. The SBOM must be used to identify known vulnerabilities by monitoring public vulnerability databases. There are some challenges of risk analysis based on threat modeling. So, for example, we do not know very much about the specific attacking ways compared to production control environment in the industry. So we not know currently enough about how attacks in the hospital environment work and how they are done. Threat modeling shall also not focus too much on all theoretical technical threats, but on realistic attack possibilities. So a typical attack in a hospital would be that somebody walks into the hospital, he plugs in a device into an available network port and just accesses a segregated network. So that would be a typical example of a hospital attack. It is important to be comprehensive in threat modeling and understand all possible threat scenarios, but also focus on what is a more likely versus a remote possibility. So what I always say, keep your focus on realistic risk estimation and not on too much fantasy. So that's about threat modeling and risk management. So Axel, other things that we can do in the lifecycle process?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Christian, for the great summary. And you already touched on it, right? Patchability is certainly critical, and there are two main points to consider here. One is you need to design a system so it can easily receive patches once it is out in the field. And that is certainly a pre-market activity that is part of your design, should be also part of your threat model to make sure that the way you deliver patches does not pose a risk or become a compromise to deployed machines. And then secondly, patchability is also then, or patching is part of the post-market activities where you as a manufacturer should regularly monitor cybersecurity signals, new vulnerabilities, new threats, event data from your devices, and then accordingly provide new patches to your customer base and to your fielded devices. And obviously, depending on the type of device, depending on the number of devices you have out in the field, it becomes a very different solution sometimes. So you want to provide automatically over the air, over the wire, whether you want to send out a service technician to install the patch and potentially retest, recalibrate the machine, whether you need to send patches into devices that are in the patient's home environment. Those are all fundamental differences that will determine how you approach both strategically and tactically patching. And that is really the same both here in the US via the FDA as well as over in Europe. The concept and the need to demonstrate to a approving regulator that you have a strategy for post-market maintenance and that you have the right tools in place and the right design features in your device. That is all part of your market approval submission because you need to, again, demonstrate that you're thinking about the post-market for the device that is about to be released. And typically, you think about regular cumulative updates, right? Once a year, twice a year, whatever your frequency is. That includes several patches of lower risk vulnerabilities, but both in the US and in the EU, the regulators do also consider the concept and the need for emergency patches. So, for example, if there is a vulnerability that could become a high risk, then of course the expectation is that you should release a patch much sooner and communicate about that vulnerability to your customers immediately. And I mean, as always with any change to a medical device, any software change, any patch, any update needs to be validated before it is rolled out to the market. Regulators have stated that if that patch or update merely addresses security needs and addresses vulnerabilities, then there is no need for the regulator to reapprove the device. But obviously, if you bundle together security patches with feature changes that may change the device's intended use and its initial purpose in the market, then obviously you need to seek regulator approval again.
Okay. The question is still, how else could the ventilator spam slinging have been prevented? And another possibility or another activity in the lifecycle process is more related to the testing phase, to the verification and validation phase. There are typical test methods that should be applied or must be applied in the development process. And those methods are vulnerability scan and penetration test in the end or at the end of the development phase. And they would have revealed known vulnerabilities that could have been addressed. So, for example, the penetration test has to be done independently of the development establishment. And so the chance is high to find something objectively with the help of high-skilled attack experts. Penetration tests and vulnerability scans must be repeated continuously within the life cycle of the device. So if you have a longer development phase, so you should redo penetration tests from time to time within the development phase, but also in the post-market phase. A customer of mine said the FDA asked him to do a penetration test at least once a year. Another customer reported that he was asked to do it every 6 months. So it is somehow depending on the technology, complexity, or criticality of the device or the device system we are looking at. I also know from notified bodies in Europe that they have the same expectation. So be sure that vulnerability scans and penetration tests are performed at least once in the end of the development process, but also repetitively or periodically in the post-market phase. Jona Institute and Medcrypt offer penetration tests according to the state of the art, and we often see such vulnerabilities like with the spam slinging device. They can be easily fixed before the device goes into the market. Vulnerability scans have to be done based on a public database like the Common Weakness Enumeration from the MITRE group. And this Common Weakness Enumeration lists, for example, SQL injection as a typical means of attacking a system, or others talk about attack surface reduction. So, for example, closing open ports would be a good way of preventing attacks. And so a vulnerability scan can identify open attack problems. And by that you can harden your device against such problems. FDA explicitly requires in their guidance document to use resources like the Common Weakness Enumeration, which is a public database. So make sure that you focus on such resources. The European Union focuses more explicitly on the process of assessing and managing the identified vulnerabilities. So they say you have to use a problem resolution process in order to deal with the founded or with the identified security issues. However, vulnerability scans are limited to public vulnerabilities and will not necessarily detect specific design or implementation vulnerabilities specific to your device and your system. So be sure that the vulnerability scans and penetration tests are always used together to identify specific security issues for your devices.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Christian. I just want to get back to something we started to talk about earlier, but in the context of vulnerability management, I think it's important to reiterate, and that is the responsibility of the operator, right, to manage a device's security posture, either through managing the device itself or to manage security around the device on the level of the network. But in order to do so, the operator needs to have the right documentation. And that is why regulators, again, both in the US as well as in the EU, have very specific requirements about the security documentation to be supplied together with the other device documentation. So basically, instructions on how to manage a device's security features. A manual specifically describing to the user what to do, for example, when the device is first put on the network, or should the device detect a security event, and how to put a device, let's say, in a fail-safe mode or recover from a fail-safe mode. The MDS2 form is another example. We talked about that earlier. And then certainly the SBOM. And I think what is critical also to understand for the manufacturer of a device is that they can no longer assume that that the hospital network is a secure environment. In fact, FDA has stated a couple of months ago that manufacturers should assume that hospital networks are inherently hostile. Of course, I'm not saying that all hospital networks are bad and insecure. However, you always design your device for the least secure possibility, the least secure environment. So even though I assume that most of your customers do a good job in managing and protecting their networks, you need to design for the ones that that are less competent and have less secure networks. I think that's a critical conclusion here. Obviously, network segregation is a common countermeasure. That is a good defense against external attacks, or should an attack be introduced through another attack vector, for example, a USB thumb drive, then at least network segregation prevents the spreading of the attack to too much of the rest of the hospital. It's sort of like a damage control approach. And yeah, and then of course we have the bread and butter of network security, which are firewalls. And depending on the type of device, you may consider devices or device groups to have dedicated firewalls that prevent, should the device be exposed through vulnerabilities, that device is indeed then protected.
Yeah.
Christian, back to you.
Yeah. So you told us that accompanying documentation is very crucial for the security topic. Another important thing is the manufacturer's obligation for the entire life cycle of the device. When the public vulnerability databases are continuously monitored based on the SBOM, all identified vulnerabilities must be managed in a timely manner. And also all other incidents or security incidents or vulnerabilities that are found, for example, also by complaint management, have to be managed like this. And this includes also vulnerability disclosure, so the information towards the operators or other stakeholders like medical device authorities, ISACs or ISAOs must be established. And of course, patches and updates shall be provided if applicable. So this process is sometimes called vulnerability management process, sometimes it's called software composition process, and sometimes it's called vulnerability disclosure process. So it's about knowing about vulnerabilities, doing something about those vulnerabilities, and communicating information about those vulnerabilities. And this, do not forget other resources or other sources of information about vulnerabilities. So, for example, law enforcement and government agencies, or social media, or vulnerability finders like researchers, reporting databases for medical devices. So the vigilance system or the medical device reporting system must be used to find vulnerabilities. Customer complaints can be used for finding or identifying security issues. Competitor information, web pages of open source components, for example, because they publish their vulnerabilities on their web pages, and so on. So you make use of different sources of information in your post-market surveillance system to identify incidents or vulnerabilities and manage them accordingly within the problem resolution process, or however you call it. And for that, you need a robust plan how to consume those sources of information and how to manage the identified vulnerabilities. In Europe, there's the explicit requirement to have a process for that within the quality management system. FDA focuses a little bit more on the so-called cybersecurity management plan, which is a description of that process. And content-wise, both markets require nearly the same. So you have to identify vulnerabilities and United States put a lot more focus on the membership within ISACs or ISAOs, which means that you make use of kind of information brokers, companies that share information about vulnerabilities in a protected way between all stakeholders like operators, manufacturers, authorities, and so on. Europe is not dealing so much with ISAO so far, so it's a very specific US topic. The big difference between Europe and US system about that vulnerability management process is that the FDA requires the so-called matrix. So they want to know, for example, the percentage of identified vulnerabilities that are updated or patched. That's the so-called defect density. Or they are focusing on the duration from vulnerability identification to when it is updated or patched. So you have to measure the time between getting aware of a vulnerability and providing an update or patch. And another matrix would be the duration from when an update or patch is available to complete implementation in devices deployed in the field. So all those metrics must be measured, documented, and must be used to improve the own quality management system and to be able to provide evidence to the FDA that you have your vulnerability management process under control. Another topic that is explicitly mentioned by the FDA, they require reporting of uncontrolled risks to the FDA. This requirement can be skipped according to the Postmarket guidance document if one of the following 4 conditions is met. So if you do not know of any serious events or deaths associated with the vulnerability, then you do not have to report it. Customers are informed within 30 days about the vulnerability and a remediation plan is created. The other condition is within 60 days, the manufacturer fixes the vulnerability, validates the change, and distributes the deployable fix to its customers. And the last topic would be the manufacturer is actively participating as a member of an ISAC or ISAO and shares vulnerability information and threat information that impact the medical device. So under those conditions, you do not have to report uncontrolled risks to the FDA. The European system is very clear about this post-market system. They just say you must have a vulnerability management process. That's it.
So, yeah, I mean, just to summarize a couple of points here and, relating it back to our ventilator example from earlier, clearly security features and a proper security architecture are part of the solution, but also proper documentation and proper communication, things like SBOM, including supplemental information like end-of-life data and support status, activities around vulnerability monitoring and scanning, and then obviously vulnerability management, threat modeling, risk management, overall the approach of a resilient design and architecture, documentation for the operator, specifically addressing their security needs and security responsibilities, which then leads to post-market management, which is a collective effort between both the manufacturer and the operator. And then, of course, one thing we already touched on earlier, one thing many hospitals unfortunately have struggled with, and it needs to be addressed in order to make progress, is inventory management and visibility. Right? How good is actually their understanding of what is on the network, and are they actually able to reliably find devices that have a new vulnerability being identified or have a new patch that should be deployed to them? And I think that is also an area where improvement would be needed. Christian, you already started talking a little bit about differences between the US and Europe. And I see in the chat, actually, some people are also asking about that. Is there anything else we need to know about how those two different regulatory environments affect how we approach security?
Yeah, I would say there's a very clear conclusion and a very short conclusion about the gaps between Europe and US market. I would say the IEC 81001-5-1 is a standard that describes the security life cycle of devices, of medical devices. And this is a recognized consensus standard in the US market and also the to be harmonized standard in Europe. And by the way, it's already the standard that is mandatory for the Japanese market. So we can take that as a common ground between both markets, US market and Europe. And on top of that, the FDA has very precise, specific requirements, additional requirements within their guidance documents. So as I said, for example, the SBOM specifications or the matrix that have to be measured during the post-market system. So as a kind of recommendation to the manufacturers, implement IEC 81001-5-1 into your quality management system and look for specific additional topics that are mentioned by the FDA guidance documents, and then you should have full compliance in terms of cybersecurity of medical devices.
And then we
yeah,
have about 5 minutes left if we want to go into some of the other questions that we've received.
yeah, we're wrapping up. Thank you. Yeah, so we did just to add on to Christian's point about 81001 and regulatory differences. We recently published a joint white paper that actually deals exactly with that topic, contrasting how FDA and EU overlap, but also differ in some areas, and how that maps against standards like 81001. And then, of course, both companies provide services and can share our expertise with you as a medical device manufacturer. If you have specific questions, we can address. With that, maybe we look at some of the questions.
So one of the questions you received in the beginning when you were talking about the SBOMs was, are these examples or were they all theoretical?
Good question. I didn't find a clear reference to that example, to that case study that we showed, but there are many similar real-world examples that we really can follow up in the news or in the publications. So I think it's not very important whether this case study was a realistic one. It could have happened or it could happen anytime.
And then another question was, some people in the chat answered it as well, but how many layers do you expect an SBOM to be? Is the immediate layer of the components enough?
So the goal is obviously to have a complete inventory of all software components in a device. We need to recognize, and I hope regulators recognize that as well, that the industry is still maturing and still learning. Because if you really want to go down to all levels of your SBOM, that requires the right tooling, that requires that your suppliers work with you on disclosing their respective SBOM of their subcomponents, and that you have the right processes in place to then build that compound SBOM that reflects the entire device. Again, the goal would be to have indeed a complete inventory of all software components, but I would expect that we as the medical device industry we need to spend a couple of years to mature to that level.
And then do you have any examples of medical device appropriate SBOM management softwares?
Yeah, I think there are many software solutions, also freeware or open source solutions, for example, by OWASP. I think Medcrypt has a web page that shows a lot of references to such tools, and Medcrypt also offers some SBOM management tools on their own, so as an own product. So Axel already said something about that.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. Indeed, so we need to differentiate here between the, let's call it the parts of the process, right? There's the two distinct process steps. One is the extraction of an SBOM, right? You have a given system, whatever your platform of choice is, and you are building the SBOM. There are certain sets of tools that focus on that extraction process. And those tools are highly platform dependent, depending on your development environment, depending on your operating system you develop under. There are different tools that are advisable for that extraction process. Sorry. And as Christian was saying, they are listed on the Medcrypt website. The second part of the process deals with then the vulnerability identification, vulnerability management, as well as managing the supplemental information, like, for example, end of life, end of support status, license status, and so forth. And for that, indeed, we have a tool you can find on our website. The tool's name is Helm, HELM, that helps you with managing the regulatory aspects of an SBOM, so that you can provide all the components and all the important steps we talked about in this presentation.
You. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the hour. Certainly appreciate all the information our presenters from Medcrypt gave us today, and our audience for attending this session. Thank you guys again. I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
And apologies for the audio problems in the beginning, but hopefully it was better for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you and bye.
Thank you. Bye.